Episode 11. The Roman Trial. Luke and John. Luke's account of Jesus' trial before Pilate is structured rather differently to Mark's and Matthew's. He develops the theme of Pilate's efforts to release Jesus further. In typically Lucan style, he shows attention to detail, and he gives the impression of background research that enables him to construct a persuasively plausible sequence of action and dialogue. He introduces one striking new element to the narrative. This may in part be an example of Luke's attention to legal detail. When Pilate discovers that Jesus is from Galilee, he realizes that he comes under Herod's jurisdiction and sends him to Herod, who happens to be in Jerusalem for the Passover as well. But this element is also the point at which dramatic threads that have run throughout Luke's Gospel are now tied together. Go back to the beginning of each of Luke's first 3 chapters. He sets the events in a precise context, dating them by the holders of great office: Herod the Great, Caesar Augustus, Quirinius, governor of Syria. In chapter 3, as he describes the work of John the Baptist and Jesus' own baptism, Luke names Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate, Herod, tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip and Lysanias as co-tetrarchs, and in Jerusalem, Annas and Caiaphas are high priests. At that point in the Gospel, Jesus is very far from the centres of power. We can see here, though, in this chapter, that Jesus has now come into the presence of each of these great powers. Herod, representative of Jewish monarchy. The chief priests, representatives of Jewish priestly authority. Pilate, representative of the Roman emperor. And Luke has laid a trail in his Gospel pointing towards this moment. He hints at indirect interaction between Herod and Jesus, and Herod's interest in Jesus. Luke's Jesus also shows awareness of Pilate. He refers to the latter's bloodthirsty act, mixing rebels' blood with the sacrifices. Amongst other things, Luke seems to be preparing for this moment when Jesus finally appears before the great powers for judgment, a symbolic moment that reveals the universal meaning of Jesus' story, both for the Jewish people and for the nations. Luke develops Mark's brief phrase, "and they accused him of many things," into the kind of dialogue that might have persuasive force for a governor. "We found him causing unrest among our people, preventing them giving taxes to Caesar, claiming to be the anointed one, the king." We now understand why Pilate asks Jesus the deadly question, "Are you the king of the Jews?" When he receives the answer, "It is you who say so," he dismisses the charge. Note how Luke emphasizes that Pilate has passed judgment. Jesus is not guilty. However, the dialogue continues with the high priests and the crowds. These insist that he is stirring up the people with his teaching throughout Judea after beginning in Galilee. Luke, perhaps like our modern scholars, may have found little evidence for a custom of releasing prisoners at festival time, and he does not mention it. Instead, the word Galilee allows Pilate to deflect immediate responsibility for Jesus' fate to Herod, tetrarch of Galilee, who happens to be in town. The scene shifts to Herod, who is delighted to see him at last and hopes to witness some sign or miracle. He questions him respectfully. But now Jesus is silent. When the chief priests and scribes accuse him vehemently, Herod grows impatient and dismisses him. In Luke's account, it is now Herod and his soldiers who dress Jesus up in an expensive garment and send him back to Pilate, but without the violence and the torture. Notice that there is no crown of thorns. Luke will echo this pairing of governor and tetrarch in a different register in the Acts of the Apostles, when Paul defends himself first before the Roman governor and then before the court of Herod Agrippa. But here, Luke chooses to add a significant detail. we see a first anticipation of the saving effects of Jesus' mission. On that day, Pilate and Herod were reconciled. Reconciliation, above all the reconciliation between Gentile and Jew, is a dominant theme in Luke. Pilate and Herod, enemies before, become friends through the unexpected and hidden mediation of their prisoner. Now Pilate summons the chief priests and the people, goes through their charges and dismisses them. He declares both his judgment and Herod's judgment. Jesus has done nothing worthy of the death penalty. He'll have him flogged and released. Luke thus gives a relatively positive account of the processes of Roman justice up to this point. He shows a similar optimism, perhaps rooted in a genuine experience, in Acts of the Apostles, where he describes the Roman governor intervening to protect Paul from being attacked when the religious wrangling boils over into physical violence. That passage in Acts suggests it wasn't completely unusual for Roman governors to have to insist on due process and find themselves protecting individuals from religious vigilante justice. Luke, as we have seen, avoids the scene of the Roman soldiery mocking and tormenting the prisoner. However, as in the other Gospels, Luke's Pilate reveals that he will only go so far to protect the innocent. The crowd shouts back to get rid of Jesus and demands the release of Barabbas. Luke gives no hint of any custom behind this request. The demand seems to come ad hoc and without explanation. He emphasizes with Mark that Barabbas is in prison for being part of a riot and committing murder. He also emphasizes that Pilate wants to release Jesus. 3 times he addresses the crowd, but they insist on their accusations and demand his crucifixion. Luke again seems to be attentive to procedure. When the voices of the crowd prevail, Pilate adapts his earlier judgment. He condemns Jesus on the charge that they have brought. Luke underlines the irony of this action. He released the one they asked for, imprisoned for rebellion and murder, and handed Jesus over for what they willed. Phrases from the 4th servant song hang in the background. By force and law he was taken. Would anyone plead his cause? Harshly dealt with, he bore it humbly, though he had done no wrong, and there had been no perjury in his mouth, letting himself be taken for a sinner. The mysterious servant is thus unjustly condemned. But by his sufferings he will enable many to become just in the sight of God by taking their faults on himself. Those are ideas we'll have to look at more closely later. What we can note here is that in parallel with a familiar, cruel story of human political injustice, there runs a deeper narrative of a divine project of rescue and healing. The gospel reader is asked to recognize and identify with both of these narratives as they intertwine. Jesus is continually being handed over. He is handed over by Judas to the temple guard and handed over by the governor for crucifixion. But at the same time, and through the same events, the Son of Man is being handed over into the power of sinners in order to rescue and restore the world. It is this divine narrative that carries the ultimate key to the meaning of the whole. The dialogue with Pilate in John's Gospel is a much fuller, more elusive and more complex development of the spare dialogue fragments found in Mark. And it makes these 2 narrative levels explicit. John's Jesus is fully aware of what he is doing and has agency throughout. John once more gives details of place and setting that are absent from the other Gospels. They take Jesus from Caiaphas to the Praetorium, the Roman barracks in Jerusalem. They don't cross the threshold. This is so that they won't be polluted and so that they will be able to eat the Passover meal. This reminds the reader that in John's Gospel, the Passover hasn't happened yet. In a powerful symbolism, Jesus' crucifixion will coincide with the slaughter of the Passover lambs in the temple. Pilate goes out to meet Jesus' accusers. The inconclusive dialogue perhaps captures something authentic in the complex relationship between the governor and his proxies from the Jewish priestly aristocracy. When asked what the charge is, they answer, "We wouldn't have handed him over to you if he wasn't a criminal." Pilate scents something evasive and asks them to try Jesus by their own law. Whereupon the accusers, now identified as the Judeans, tell him, "We do not have authority to kill a person." This disturbs Pilate, who goes into the barracks and asks the familiar question, "Are you king of the Jews?" Jesus' reply, though, is fuller. Is it Pilate asking this, or someone else said something? Pilate makes his own distance from the issues plain. He is not Jewish. It's Jesus' own people and the chief priests have handed him over. Pilate asks, "What did you do?" Jesus prefers to answer the previous question. His kingdom is not of this world. Otherwise, his servants would have fought to prevent him being handed over to the Judeans. His kingdom is not from here. This is both a challenge to Pilate, representative of the Roman emperor, and a puzzle. So you are a king then? Pilate, like so many others in the Gospel, struggles to understand a familiar word used in a new way. Jesus answers with a riddling reply. He begins with the familiar, "It is you who say so," but then introduces a new and disruptive discourse that requires the reader to hear familiar words in a new way. "It was for this that I was born and came into the world, to witness to the truth. All who are of the truth hear my voice." The language echoes sermons of Jesus from earlier in the Gospel, where he speaks of those who belong to him recognizing his voice, the voice of the true shepherd. But it also echoes an adversarial theme that recurs in the language of the Jewish Qumran groups. The truth of the teacher of righteousness is to be upheld against the hostile forces who maintain the lie. Jesus' testimony to the truth against all opposition catches an echo of philosophical themes found in Jewish writings of the time. Like the prophets who suffered for presenting God's truth, he stands in the shoes of Socrates, the Greek philosopher martyr, put on trial unjustly. And Jesus' truth is inevitably self-referential, for he has already declared himself the way, the truth, and the life. The challenge that runs through the whole gospel has been to recognize him as the one truly sent by God to save the world, and to believe in him. He is thus ultimate truth, and rightly seen, the one worthy of total commitment. This riddling language draws Pilate into the cosmic trial that frames the whole gospel. Will he recognize Jesus as the truth? Will he acknowledge that his earthly understanding of kingdom and justice must give way before something higher and deeper? Pilate gives an earthbound answer that could come from any philosophical treatise. What is truth? But nevertheless, he does go back to the Judeans and tell them that he finds no charge against Jesus. John's Pilate does invoke the custom of setting a prisoner free, but here it is presented as a custom that comes from the people. You have a custom, as I release a prisoner for you at Passover. He asks them if they want him to release the king of the Jews. They shout, "Not him, but Barabbas." John adds that Barabbas was a brigand, as in Matthew, no mention of rioting. Pilate's response is to have Jesus whipped. We then see the familiar scene of the soldier's gratuitous brutality, the purple garment, the crown of thorns, the mock obeisance. But in John, Pilate now takes Jesus out, still dressed up, and presents him to the Jerusalem crowd. "I'm bringing him out so that you can see that I find no crime in him." Does he expect that the violence and humiliation will be enough to satisfy Jesus' accusers? Jesus himself emerges wearing the crown of thorns and the purple garment, and Pilate says to the crowd, "Here is the man." Once again, the words reach beyond the narrative to the reader. They are an invitation to contemplate, to see this Jesus who is both the ultimate symbol of suffering humanity and at the same time the one who is most truly king. The simple word man, or more literally human being, can be read at two levels. At one level we can hear the everyday a person, as Pilate presents him to the crowds. But at the other level we can hear this human being as the human, Adam, the archetype of all humankind. We have a hint of language found in St. Paul's letters. These describe Jesus as a new Adam, the firstborn of all creation, and the firstborn from the dead, in whom all humanity can find life and forgiveness. But any mood of contemplation is broken by the response of the chief priests and their servants, who shout out, "Crucify him." Pilate tells them to crucify him themselves. He finds him innocent. The Judeans then add a new element to the charge. We have a law. By that law he should die because he has claimed to be Son of God. This alarms Pilate. But is it because Jesus might have usurped an imperial title? Or is it because he intuits something transcendent in Jesus? His question, "Where are you from?" does seem to pick up on Jesus' earlier statement, "My kingdom is not from here." When Jesus keeps silence, Pilate presses him, "Don't you realize that I have authority to release you and to crucify you?" This is the cue for Jesus to affirm that parallel divine narrative which relativizes earthly powers and actions, even the power of Rome. You would have no power if it had not been given to you from above. That is why the one who handed me over has the greatest sin. What is happening is unfolding according to the will of God. Pilate is now determined to release Jesus, but the Judeans put a political pressure on him. To release someone claiming to be king is to reveal that one is no friend of Caesar. The implied threat was genuinely deadly. Under Tiberius, senators could be forced into exile or even to suicide when their enemies suggested that they had spoken against the emperor in some way. John seems to capture here a real vulnerability of Pilate in his relationship with the Jerusalem elite. The veiled threat leaves Pilate no way out. At midday on Passover preparation day, at an area called the Pavement, he sits on his judgment seat, brings Jesus out, and presents him to the Judeans. "Here is your king." When they shout, "Away with him, crucify him," Pilate asks again, "Do you want me to crucify your king?" They answer, "We have no king but Caesar." And Pilate hands Jesus over to them to be crucified. How are we to read this last passage? Pilate is the first complete foreigner to engage at length with Jesus, and has clearly been disturbed by the encounter. But is he convinced of Jesus' true identity when he asks, "Do you want me to crucify your king?" Or is he displaying his contempt for the local leaders who have just humiliated him and forced his hand? And when they say, "We have no king but Caesar," is that a spontaneous, if not entirely sincere, declaration of loyalty to Rome? Or is it a grudging quid pro quo, which allows Pilate to extract a public confession of loyalty from the Jewish leadership and salvage some authority in the situation? Notice how this dialogue lends itself to multiple readings. But notice too how at the end, Jesus is once more handed over, finally, to be crucified. Pilate and the chief priests do have agency and responsibility, but the drama is unfolding at a deeper level as well. In the language of John, Jesus has been sent by the Father to accomplish his work. The corrupt verdict against the just man is one necessary station on the way.